one of the things that we've done with these particular evenings is recognize that actually the experience of COVID, in all its different installments, and it feels like there's still very many more to come, kind of throws up lots of thoughts and lots of questions that we have. And I guess as you've kind of experienced COVID, what has been some of the things that have been highlighted for you? What kind of has really struck you?
Mm, I think what has really struck me has been, well, there's so many things to talk about, but two things in particular. One, well, I think it has highlighted existing problems, but it's really brought them into sharp relief.
Mm,
And I think it's highlighted social inequalities and our broken relationship with the wider natural world.
mm,
So it's really highlighted social inequalities in the UK. I mean, I'm looking at all of you. I don't think I need to sort of really explain that, but I
mm,
know at the beginning of the pandemic, people talked about us all being in this together. And then there was a phrase that started to be used that I'm sure you must have heard, that we're all in the same storm, but we're in different boats. And we're all experiencing it differently. And a lot of that experience is based on socioeconomic lines and as to the sort of community we live in and the kind of job that we have, as to whether we can stay at home and isolate or whether we have to go out and work and then come into more contact with people, and things like so the well-being things of getting outside for our once a day, whether we can. So I have a garden, you know, I realized I was so privileged to have a garden that I could just spend time, step outside my door and be in my garden, whereas others who are in flats didn't have access to that so easily. And we know that a lot of that fell along race lines as well, and fell disproportionately onto people of colour and black people, and that became a real focus, didn't it? So it has highlighted the socioeconomic inequalities in the UK, but also globally. So my work at Tear Fund, where we work with around 50 countries around the world, and helping communities respond to the pandemic in South Sudan or the DRC, India, Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh are the largest refugee camp, where they don't even have access to running water and soap, let alone be able to do all the hygiene things and distance by 2 meters and so on. And working with communities that depend on a daily wage. So if you go into lockdown and things close, if you can't work that day, literally you don't have the money to buy food the next day. So it's really highlighted the global inequalities that we have, as well as the UK inequalities. And then secondly, I know there was two things in one, but secondly, highlighting the broken relationship we have with the wider world,
mm,
because the sad reality is that what we are experiencing isn't a natural disaster.
mm,
I'm sure we all know this is a disaster of our own making, but because of the way that we have treated the natural world, deforestation, bushmeat trade, wet markets and so on, that have brought us into close contact with wild animals and allowed viruses to jump species.
mm, mm,
And then our wealthy addiction to flying is then what has turned this from a local disease into a global pandemic. So we are at sort of as a species, we are all to
yeah,
blame for
yeah,
this pandemic. So for me, it's really highlighted those two things.
yeah, yeah. In some ways, you kind of mapped out three things there that they are related to one another,
Mm,
but actually, in essence, they create different kinds of tensions with one another as well. interested in your first point about the inequality stuff. You know, some of the things you've already said about what's happening elsewhere in the world feel so much more acute than they do maybe some of the challenges that we're experiencing in the UK.
Mm.
How do you hold, because you're somebody that cares about both, how do you hold that tension? How do you make sense of that tension that kind of exists between, you know, the global and the more UK wide stuff?
Well, suffering is suffering wherever it happens, right?
Right.
And someone who is living in a wealthier country and has lost their business is still suffering, even if they might not quite be in the same position as someone living in a refugee camp or living in the high-rise buildings of the big cities in India and so on. And in one sense, there are hierarchies and there are different levels, but this isn't a suffering competition,
No.
and it's hard and it's hardship wherever we are. So I think we are to care as much for our local neighbours as our global neighbours, and as much for our global neighbours as our local neighbours. So it's probably easiest for us to think about our local neighbours, and certainly that's actually been one of the really good characteristics, certainly of the first wave of lockdown, was that it really turned us out into our communities, didn't it? We had all the emphasis on that, the clapping on the Thursday and street and community WhatsApps, and you know, I shopped. I got elderly lady living next door to me, I shopped for her, and got to know my neighbour on the other side, who we've known each other for years, so it's not like we don't know each other, but we got to know each other better because we were texting and checking in on each other and so on. So there was that real localized focus, and we know that the church was brilliant at responding to that in all sorts of ways. And I would love us to see us also responding to our global neighbour. So it is holding both of those and not trying to create a competition out of levels of suffering.
Yeah, just out of interest, have you noticed that Tear Fund kind of a drop in interest within some of the global stuff during the pandemic, or has it been the reverse? How's it affected that?
Thankfully, we haven't. So it hasn't been the reverse, but we haven't seen a huge drop off
Right. Okay.
either.
Okay.
There are other aspects of the sorry, of the economic system that are causing us problems.
Yes.
But in terms of individual support, one of the things at Tear Fund is that we have really loyal supporters
Uh-huh.
and people who stick with us.
Uh-huh.
And we're so grateful for that. And so far they are sticking with us through this, which is great. And for me, it's humbling hearing all the things of the last few weeks. I know Carmel from Manchester, and others of you maybe from Manchester as well, and just all of that discussion and debate and argument that's been happening politically, which is important, and we really do need to give financial support. But then, as you said, holding that intention with the recognition that there are millions of people who don't have any sort of financial support at all. And so just remembering the position that we are in and being grateful for that, whilst, you know, not downplaying the hardship as well that comes from this.
The second kind of issue that you raised around the environment and kind of in some ways highlighting the broken relationship that we have with the environment. You know, early on there were those comments that people were making, which was, you know, there's not many people on the road, or which they really meant there's not many cars on the road, but that's a separate issue. But, you know, and kind of, oh, we'll all start seeing different. And I remember one night a stork flying onto our street and things like that. So it was kind of all a bit wild. What do you think? Do you think there's been some kind of opportunities that have started to develop? because of what's gone on with COVID, and particularly about how we view the environment.
Yeah, I really do. And again, that was one of the features, as you just said, of those early months, particularly. I think so many people rediscovered or discovered the importance of a connection with the natural world in some way, whether it's just a city park or whatever it is, or our gardens or something. The importance of that to our own mental health and well-being, and the value that people placed on being able to get out and get outside. You know, when the sun shone, there was all the big hoo-ha, everybody going to the parks, everybody going to the beach and so on. It's like, well, you know, in one sense, of course, because when the weather's nice, that's where we want to be, outside. And so a rediscovery of the good that that does to us, and the joy of not hearing cars and not living with pollution. The estate that I live on, we've got the ring road for the city that I'm in. The ring road goes right next to it, so it's a fairly polluted area and it's very noisy. And it was just an absolute delight. I'd sit out in my garden, I could hear the birds. I notice I have a fairly sort of low level asthma, and I noticed that that dropped, and I didn't need to take my inhaler as much as I do normally. You know, so it was really highlighted to us the levels of pollution that we live with normally, and all of that dropped with no aeroplanes in the skies and so on. So I think it did provide us an opportunity, and in many ways it has been a wake-up call. The challenge for us is to whether we're going to make the most of that opportunity and change how we live and change how we do things. And ultimately, so there are things that we can do, decisions that of our own that we can make. Ultimately, it does have to come down to the government. And there is an opportunity, while the government needs to put in place economic stimulus packages, we need a recovery plan, and the government is working on that. And every now and then you see some announcements about that. And this is an opportunity for the government to put in place an economic recovery package that is focused on a green economy rather than on the old fossil fueled economy that we had. So the economic path that we're on, we know that we are heading into disaster. We know that it is causing a climate crisis. We know it's destroying our wildlife. We know it's creating pandemics, and all of that will continue. When you're in business as usual and you're so wedded to a particular path, it's really hard to get off that, because that needs huge political will, which isn't there. Our economy, you know, it hasn't fully stopped, but it kind of, you know, came to a fairly rapid juddering halt. It's a very rare opportunity that you can actually step off that and do something different. So there are lots of organizations and groups calling for that, from the World Economic Forum to Greenpeace. At Tear Fund, we're running a campaign called The World Rebooted, which has got, I could find it and put it in the chat at some point.
Brilliant.
Or maybe someone could quickly put into your search engine Tear Fund The World Rebooted and put that in. And we've got resources, a video, a discussion papers and questions, things that you could bring into your churches or organisations. And then a very clear campaign asking Boris Johnson and his cabinet to focus his economic recovery on putting in place an economy, an economy that is socially just and sustainable. So we do have this big opportunity.
Yeah. And for you, what are some of the big things that need to be put in place? What, you know, if we are going to use the phrase build back better, if it's going to be greener, which it needs to be, and more environmentally conscious, what are some of the things that actually, if we don't do that, then it's going to be really difficult to make it happen?
I think it's really about investing in green industries and green businesses and moving away from those that are polluting. So let's invest our money in renewable energy, and that will create jobs and it will stimulate the economy. And let's move our money away from supporting, I mean, the airline industry is a classic, isn't it? It comes to the brink of collapse and we keep rescuing it. You know, I know it's a massive thing. And I know I have a friend who works in the airline industry and her job has been at stake. So I'm not downplaying the human cost. But this is a unique opportunity to shift away from something that we know is hugely damaging and put our money into something different. And where the government does decide to invest into industries in order to support them, then they need to put in place, what's the word I'm looking for? Strict conditions that money comes, that as part of the money coming, they reduce the emissions of their industries. So it's really about things that support the green economy, moving away from fossil fuels and stimulating the economy in a different way. And also, this isn't so much the green economy, but in terms of being socially just, putting into place something like a minimum wage would be this would be an opportunity for us to do that. Some of those things that where people fall through the gaps, the waiting. Sorry, I haven't got it in my head. Is it the 5-week wait?
Yeah, 5-week for universal credit.
Yeah, so changing that, you know, some of those basic things that we know are causing such hardship and such trouble, doing away with those and putting into place some different systems.
Well, it strikes me that we need a reframing of that whole kind of benefits narrative, so that in some ways it becomes like when you're sick, you need the NHS. When you are strapped, you need security, social security. I remember a few years ago with Poverty Truth having a conversation with one of the MPs in our city in Leeds, with people who were really facing some difficult times, and he said we the worst thing that ever happened was losing the term social security. That when you turn things from security into benefit, you reframe the conversation in kind of really more pernicious kind of way. I couldn't help but noticing, and I've already said this before we started, the Extinction Rebellion sign on your fridge magnet. And we've had I remember us having a conversation before about how it's so often those who are poorest within society who will be affected first by the environment. And yet at the same time, in many of those conversations, I'm not going to say they're not there at all, but it doesn't seem to be that they're there as strong. And in some ways, that's another tension, if you like, between the environment and those who struggle against poverty. I just wondered what your thoughts were on that, about how do we make this kind of move towards environmental sustainability? How do we include people from our communities that are often the people that are really struggling?
Yeah, and part of the problem, of course, is that sometimes doing things differently costs more. And so that can be a barrier. Now, what I've found actually is that on a sort of like for like, swapping a conventional product for an ethical alternative will be more expensive. But actually, if reframing the whole way you do things so that it's more ethical actually costs less than a regular conventional sort of budget or life. I don't quite know what the words are for that. So I know for myself, my food spend is actually quite a lot less than those around me who don't shop along ethical lines, because it's just that the whole way of shopping for me has changed. But if I just did it like for like, then it would look more expensive. But what what I realized that came down to, so sorry, maybe if I backtrack. So I looked to change the way, I'm just using food as an example. I looked to change the way that we ate sort of 20 odd years ago, and gradually took steps. And this is where, remember, we lived on a council estate
Mm.
for all of that time. And for most of my adult life, other than the last few years that I've been at Tier Fund, haven't had a regular good income because of the way that we've chosen to live as a family. Our income has been pretty low and pretty fluctuating. So I've had to learn and look at how do I live ethically on a budget, on a pretty low income. And what I discovered was that you can do it, but that actually you need a level of knowledge, and you need a level of access, and you need a level of what I would call social capital. And that's where these things intersect with other issues around social justice, and whether you have people around you who know how to do things, basic things like using leftovers, or how to use the cheap cuts of an animal or something, some sort of basic techniques. And whether you have access to particular shops, or whether you live somewhere where you're in a food desert. And those aren't so much about whether or not you can afford to do things environmentally. That's about the socio-economic setup that is around you. So these things all link together, and that's one of the things that I discovered, and is where I realized that I'm, even when I was on a low income living on a council estate, I was still privileged because I had those things which others, not everyone around me did or does.
I remember being told, I have to be careful because I think my sister-in-law is on this, so she knows how bad my cooking is. But being told by somebody how to make a chicken last for a full family for 4 days, and the different ways in which you could use the chicken to be able to do that, is quite remarkable. And we've talked a lot about kind of economics, environmentalism. I guess I'm interested in, how does theology come into that? Both of us managed to have the same supervisors for our doctorates at different times. And I guess just reading some of yours through around Aquinas and people like that, do they help bring a degree of vision to those tensions? How does it work for you?
Okay, I will answer that. Let me just go back and say one thing before we sort of move off the pandemic and our response to that and so on. If we're moving off that, I'm not sure. Just to say around that, in that environmental side, and the pandemic highlighting our relationship to the natural world and the church response. So I think the church has responded brilliantly in so many ways, reaching out, the grief and counselling and funeral and support and food banks, and so many different things in different ways. But I think we have missed it when it has come to those broader, those bigger pictures of what the pandemic is highlighting. So when it first hit, for me, it was just so obvious that this was just shining a huge light on the fact that our relationship with nature was broken. Because we knew where the pandemic pretty much, it was obvious where the pandemic had come from. We know that Ebola, SARS, AIDS, they've all come from these same sort of areas. So we knew that the pandemic had come from our own activities. The World Bank has been predicting this for years. And this was just crying out, look what this is exposing. And I expected church leaders, I thought this is a fantastic opportunity for the church to be saying, look, our relationship with nature is broken. We need to take this opportunity to get it back and to reset ourselves. And in those first few weeks, tuning in, there was a big conference, Christian conference happening at the time. And I tuned into some of the seminars from some key church leaders, bishops and so on. around what is God doing through the pandemic. And I was waiting for this message, but they were so focused on the church going online and being able to reach people online and the big opportunities that that gave us, which I really rejoice in, and I think that's a part of it. But I was waiting for them to say, what's the bigger thing that is happening here? And I didn't hear it from anyone. And I was just, hello, where are you? Where are you looking? You're missing the what this is telling us. So anyway, just to say that.
Yeah, no, it's great.
When it comes to, so following on from that, actually thinking theologically, when we look in the Bible, we see that there is like this triangle of relationships between God, the people, and the land. And those three things always work together all the way through the Old Testament and then into the New. So we were created to be in relationship with God, with other people, and with the wider natural world. And then the fall broke those relationships. And the rest of the Bible is really the story of God working to put those relationships back to rights, ultimately in Jesus. And so all the way through, God, the people, and the land are closely, intricately, integrally connected. And so if any one of those connections is broken, then it impacts the whole thing, which is what we see in the pandemic. You know, this isn't only an environmental disaster. An environmental disaster has led to an economic disaster and a social disaster. And so these things are linked and you can't pull them apart. And the Bible is clear that practicing social justice, taking care of those who are poor, taking care of the needy, go hand in hand with the state of the land, and together are a part of what it means to be righteous, to be in a right relationship with God. So when we're not in a right relationship with God, you don't know that by whether you practice your Sabbath or your new moon feasts or what have you. You know that by whether you take care of the needy or practice dishonest trading standards. And when you don't do that, then the land responds. In Jeremiah 4, it talks about the land mourning because of the sin of the people, because they're not taking care of those who are in poverty. So the land responds, that there's a real sense of agency to the land in how the land is talked about in some of that, the Old Testament, the prophetic and the Psalms, and in Deuteronomy. So there's that clear link there. And we see that illustrated today in what we are seeing in the pandemic.